Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid I'm going to now lower the tone significantly from the exalted heights that you've been at to date. I'm going to descend into the deep and dastardly world of sanctions and criminal law and bribery, corruption in the global sense. Now, the good news is that I have, with Narendra's permission, reduced my usual 4 to 5 hour presentation to just 15 minutes, which is now only about 14 minutes, so it'll be brief. The bad news is that really this is an incredibly important area where the stakes are very, very high, and if you get this wrong, you will go out of business. We are seeing an unprecedented amount of global cooperation among the regulators, among the international police, as it were, and the consequences of infringing sanctions or infringing any of the other regulatory regime are catastrophic for your business and could literally put you out of business and indeed put you in jail. So you can see this is a very cheerful topic that I'm embarking on. And those of you that have heard me speak before will know that I like to kick things off with a bit of humor. And it's very hard to find humor in sanctions. It's a very dull and boring subject, quite frankly. But the great thing about the United States' current president is you can always find something to laugh about, whatever you think about him. And I have found some humor here. And there it is. Wonderful hairdo. I'm quite jealous because, of course, hair is not really my strong point, to put it mildly. But his hair is remarkable. And what I have deduced from this and other photos I'm going to show you, hair is incredibly important in politics. Indeed, you might say hair is the only thing that matters, because this is one of our politicians, a very similar hairstyle to Donald. By the way, Donald Trump's mother is Scottish. I'm Scottish too, so that's the only thing I like about him. A lovely lady from the island of Lewis, who fled the country to seek her fame and fortune in America and met Donald's father, and the rest is history, as they say. So hair is important, but not everyone has it, and we know that this man, of course, quite relevant when it comes to sanctions. Slightly annoyingly, actually, he was, that's Putin, by the way, in case you didn't recognize him, President Putin. He was actually in this hotel, was it 2 years ago, Narendra? Staying here, and it was very annoying for me because everyone kept coming up to me and saying they thought I looked like him, which really upset me. Punched everyone in the face that said that to me. Anyway, so what are we here to talk about? Well, the sanctions regime. I want to talk really about two things mainly, sanctions and the bribery corruption regime, both of which have really got significantly worse over the last few years. Now, this is a map of the current sanctions regime, and I'm not going to go through it all. You can see that there's EU sanctions, US sanctions, UN sanctions, etc. Those are the countries that are subject to sanctions at the moment. It is very much a movable feast. Things change incredibly quickly, as we know from President Trump and other changes in the regime involving Russia, etc., etc. So really, if you want to look into the sanction situation, you have to be absolutely up to date with your information. I strongly advise you not to type into Google what sanctions might apply to my business, because you won't get the right answer. It is amazing what people type into Google these days from a legal point of view. It absolutely amazes me that people think they'll get the correct answer from Google. I'm not going to go into the sanctions in any real detail, other than to simply say that I think probably one of the most important aspects of sanctions is that the financial services community, the banking world, will take a very risk-averse situation to anything relating to sanctions, which essentially means you can't do business if you're not getting the funding, if the backers aren't behind you. And sanctions are now very much firmly part of the overall global landscape. Now, I think what is interesting about global regulation is that it is now very much joined up. We all have these awful telephones, we're all on email, we're all sending each other messages constantly. Every single message, every single electronic thing that you do is recoverable, discoverable, and can be used in subsequent enforcement proceedings. And it is quite unbelievable what people will write in emails, in tweets, in texts, and make no mistake, all of it, if you ever are the subject of an investigation, it will all be discovered by the regulator and used in court. So this is really something that is incredibly important to bear in mind, because the global regulators all speak to each other, they're all connected to each other, they're sharing information, and of course they do joint investigations, as we will see in a moment. There's obviously lots of different types of sanctions. As I say, I'm not going to go into these, but there's essentially two categories. There's list-based regimes and activity-based regimes, but really what you need to do if you think you might be affected by sanctions is look at it very, very carefully with your counsel, with either your in-house counsel or your external counsel, and make sure you've got absolutely up-to-date information in relation to that. Now, of course, President Trump, as we've mentioned before, this is a tweet. It is wonderful, isn't it, the way he tweets? Always at 2 o'clock in the morning. This one's at 2:31 a.m. Of course, he doesn't drink, so you can't blame alcohol for some of the things he comes out with. He does eat hamburgers, we understand. And he tweets, this is his tweet about Iran. And we know that he's on the warpath. We know that there is resistance to this. And it will be very interesting to see how it plays out with other countries and the EU generally. But certainly President Trump has made his position very, very clear as far as Iran is concerned. Now, in the remaining 7 minutes, I want to touch on a couple of other subjects, namely bribery and corruption. Now, this is a lady who you will probably not recognize. She is the new chief of the Serious Fraud Office in the UK. Now, the reason I've put her photograph up is to demonstrate the globalization of this area of law, because Lisa Ozovsky is actually an American citizen, an American lawyer. She used to work for the FBI as counsel. She used to work for the Department of Justice in the US. And her appointment is very significant because it demonstrates a change in the way this area is going to be enforced, because she is focusing very much on global cooperation. She's focusing very much on adopting the US model of enforcement, and it really does represent a significant change and demonstrates how global this area is becoming in terms of enforcement. Now, that is a map of the world which is published by an organization called Transparency International. Yes, the Transparency International Corruptions Index, its perceptions of corruption, I hasten to say. Now, what can you learn from this map? Well, what I take from it is the only safe place to do business is Antarctica, because you'll notice that it's the only place in the world, apparently, where there's no bribery and corruption. So if you want a bribery and corrupt-free place, go up with the penguins and you'll have a fantastic time up there. But I stress that it is the perception of corruption, but the bottom line is that the oil and gas industry, the energy sector, is operating in some of the most difficult areas in the world as regards compliance, as you can see from the map. And these are the main producing countries at the moment. On the right-hand column, you'll see where they rank in the index, and most of the main producers are ranking in the bottom quartile out of 180 countries that have been looked at. The main oil and gas producing regions are obviously in the bottom quarter. So it's a tricky area. Okay, there we go, it's up now. The other issue that the industry has is that it has very complicated contracting structures involving joint ventures, joint operating agreements, partnerships, etc. And if you get in a situation where you are the company at the top of that chart, the yellow company at the top, and you are somehow linked through this chain, and this is a relatively straightforward chain, there can be much more complicated ones, you're somehow linked to the company in the red who is committing the bribery, and this is actually a case that I'm doing at the moment involving Nigeria, where my client is the yellow client at the top, the bribery is going on in the bottom left corner, and the question is the yellow company responsible for the actions of the red company, even though there's several layers between them? And does the UK Bribery Act have extraterritorial application to Nigeria? Well, the answer to that is yes, but the question of where the liability lies is another issue. Because, of course, all of these laws, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, the Bribery Act in the UK, the sanctions laws, they all have extraterritorial application. So it doesn't really matter where the incident occurs. Now, things have been getting very bad recently. This is a graph showing the amount of enforcement action going on in the US. And you can see that it's absolutely gone through the roof in the last couple of years. More and more enforcement actions for alleged bribery and corruption and other similar offences, and the sanctions have been going through the roof as well. So these are the penalties, and you'll see that really up until about 2005, the penalties were relatively not very high at all, and then suddenly we get penalties of hundreds of millions of dollars in relation to this type of activity. The UK, of course, itself, this is a graph which shows the budget for the Serious Fraud Office on the left side, which is £50 million, and on the right side is what they are returning to the Treasury in fines and penalties, 500 million. So you don't need to be a rocket science to work out this is very profitable for the government to pursue this, because the fines that they get go back into the Treasury as they do in most countries. Yeah, this is a picture you'll probably recognize of a Rolls Royce. And the reason I show that is that we've had a recent case in the UK involving Rolls Royce where they got absolutely clobbered for bribery and corruption, which was going on all over the world. And to cut a long story short, they were fined £500 million. They were also prosecuted or pursued in the US, where they were fined $170 million, and the Brazilian authorities also went after them. So this is a good example, really, of how activity in certain countries in the world can lead to enforcement, really, in a number of different jurisdictions. Didn't put Rolls-Royce out of business, but it certainly very nearly did. I'll finish on the cheerful note of the Oil case. This is a case involving alleged bribery in relation to agents in Monaco. And this really affects a huge amount of oil and gas companies that used Oil as their agent to do business in Kazakhstan and other parts of the world. And this has become a massive scandal. Lots of companies are being investigated, not only by the UK authorities, by the US authorities, and by other global authorities. And the use of agents is an area of tremendous difficulty. We all know that agents are necessary. It's pretty much impossible to avoid them. But if you are using agents, be extremely careful about the due diligence that you do, and make sure that you have a good paper trail to demonstrate that you have checked the agents out before you use them, and that, of course, their remuneration is somehow commensurate with what they actually do for you. So there's a great big red sign saying my time is up, and I don't want to get in trouble with Narendra. So on that note, I will check out, and thank you very much for listening.